An 11th weekend of protests in Hong Kong ends with the deployment of riot police. Crowds of pro-democracy and pro-government activists packed the streets amid deepening divisions and mounting pressure from Beijing. Crowds fill Khartoum's streets to hail a new Sudan after generals and opposition leaders sign a landmark deal for a transition to civilian rule. And international representatives meet to decide how to protect the planet's most vulnerable species. It comes after a UN warning that extinction is looming for over 1 million species of flora and fauna. Well, we begin in Hong Kong, where pro-democracy activists staged an 11th weekend of protests as concerns mount over Beijing's next move. The rallies ended with riot police being deployed to chase down a group of pro-democracy protesters who'd surrounded a police station in the Mong Kok district. Divides are deepening in the city. Thousands of pro-government supporters waving Chinese flags gathered in a park to support security forces, while earlier in the day, teachers became the latest group to rally against police brutality towards young protesters. Anka Ula has more.
Protect the next generation. That's the rallying cry that's got thousands of teachers marching in Hong Kong this weekend. They braved the rain to show protesters, many of whom are students, that they are not alone.
I can't really stand seeing them standing at the front line, saving our city for us. I think that's not safe. That's not fair. They are just a student.
Very worried about their physical safety, because now the police seems to be beating people indiscriminately.
It's a key moment for the movement. Escalating violence has fueled opposition to the pro-democracy cause and deepened divisions in Hong Kong. Thousands gathered in a counter-protest to show their support of China, as a giant screen replayed scenes of protesters clashing with police. For these Hong Kongers, democracy is not the answer.
Democracy is not a good thing. We shouldn't have democracy. Why should we have democracy? Because you look at the Beijing government, they don't have democracy, but they're doing a good job. The economy is good, is going a good way. So why should we have democracy?
If you read the news, you will know that America is supporting the protesters. Everybody knows that. The Americans don't want China to be strong.
Across the border in Shenzhen, Chinese paramilitary are still holding drills, maintaining fears that they could be sent in to suppress the protests.
Well, let's move on now. And the Russian opposition activists are holding one-man protests in Moscow to circumvent official restrictions. The protests are a far cry from the wave of rallies that saw tens of thousands take to the streets after opposition figures were banned from local elections a month ago. At the same spot this Saturday, thousands of Communist Party supporters held an authorized rally. They too are demanding free and fair elections, but they refuse to support the liberal opposition. Anka Ula has the story.
Calling for fair and free elections. Some 4,000 members of the Communist Party of Russia took to the streets in Moscow to condemn the ruling party's tactics in an upcoming municipal vote.
Is it a normal election when the ruling party hides its face behind new election hoardings? In Moscow, not a single candidate from United Russia is running as a member of United Russia.
The normally low-key city council vote has become a flashpoint for Russia's liberal opposition, after authorities barred some opposition candidates from running. Moscow erupted in mass protests after the decision, which have continued for weeks. More than 2,000 people were detained by police for participating in what authorities called illegal protests. Saturday marks the first lull in opposition demonstrations in 5 weeks. The Communist rally is the only authorized gathering in the capital this weekend. Liberal opposition leaders were denied a permit to demonstrate. The Communists are tolerated by the Kremlin. Their candidates were allowed to register. The party says it will not support the liberal opposition's protest.
Well, France 24's Nick Holdsworth is in central Moscow to meet with the opposition protesters.
Recent weeks in Russia, there have been regular protests every Saturday that have drawn up to 60,000 people, as we saw last weekend. Today, the protests, the pro-democracy protests, are of a very different nature. People are coming and standing with a placard and making an individual protest. This is the only kind of protest in Russia that is legally allowed without permission of the authorities. And those that are bravely standing here today explain that they feel that these protests are just as valid and just as important as those mass protests we've seen in recent weeks.
It is very important to continue with the protests. It's not possible that every week thousands come out on the streets. It's not physically possible, but all the same, we need people to come out each week.
Right now, the safest way to protest is by individual, one-person pickets. Mass demonstrations and actions are not permitted. If we just come out on the streets or walk in groups, there's a chance that many will be arrested or face large fines and a criminal record.
Those who should face charges are the police, who've been beating protesters, and those who gave them the orders to do so. All the peaceful protesters who've been arrested so far must be released without delay.
The Kremlin has commented for the first time on these protests, basically dismissing them, defending police tactics, which have been quite violent in recent weeks, with thousands arrested, hauled indiscriminately off the streets, and some of them beaten with truncheons. These protests are going to continue, and we are expecting further mass actions in the coming weeks before September's city council elections.
That's Nick Holdsworth reporting there for us. Now, there's celebration in Sudan after top generals and the country's pro-democracy movement signed a final power-sharing deal at a ceremony in the capital, Khartoum. The agreement paves the way for a transition to civilian rule following the military overthrow of longtime President Omar al-Bashir in April. It brings an end to months of unrest, which saw dozens of protesters killed. Now, the deal, which was formally agreed earlier this month, kicks off a 3-year transition period under which Sudan will be ruled by a new ruling body composed of 6 civilians and 5 generals. Well, for more analysis, we can now bring in Jian Boudiaf, a country risk analyst who joins us from London. Thanks for joining us on the programme. Are you optimistic that this deal will lead Sudan into a new era of democracy, like many people hope?
What is more important is to know whether Sudanese are optimistic. And I think that for a lot of the Sudanese protesters, this is a very important step that is happening in the country. It's a historic move. This is the first time that the military and the opposition alliance have been able to reach an agreement. In the past few months, the agreements, they have failed. One of the main reasons is also because of the paramilitary, the Janjaweed action, and the violent crackdown on protesters. So I think that this is an important step for the country. However, there are still a few challenges to look out for and ahead that the opposition has to be careful about. One of them is the fact that even though they have majority in the Sovereign Council, the military will be the ones leading this presidential council in the 21st month of the transition. So therefore, they can impose their will if they wish to do so. Also, the economic situation in Sudan is still very fragile. According to certain economists, real inflation is reaching about 70%, and there is the informal sector and so on. One other question that is very important, which is from a security perspective, is what will happen to the rapid support forces, so the paramilitary forces that carry some of these violences against protesters. Are they going to be integrated in the Sudanese army, or are they going to convert or just continue doing the same? And that might be a problem on how to manage them in the future.
Now, you were talking about economic problems. Now, economic woes, of course, triggered the protests that have led us to this moment. Do you think that the transitional Prime Minister, Abdullah Hamdok, will be able to turn things around?
Well, first of all, the Prime Minister, he's set to become Prime Minister, but he still has to accept this position. He's known as a technocrat, and many Sudanese see him as being able to carry this challenging task. However, it's important to know that there are certain factors that are not only in the hands of the Sudanese. So, for example, Sudan is in need of international support from international donors, but also international creditors such as the IMF, if they need to do so, or international banks. And so far, many of these international banks have been unable or at least afraid to enter the Sudanese market because there are still sanctions, and Sudan is still under the state-sponsored terrorism list by the United States.
Okay, Jeanne Boudiaf, thank you very much for your time. Well, it seems time is running out for Jakarta. The Indonesian capital is one of the fastest sinking cities on Earth. Environmental experts warn that 1/3 of it could be underwater by 2050 if current rates continue. Now, existing measures have had little impact, so authorities are taking drastic action, moving the capital elsewhere. Mario Sofos explains.
Battered by waves, this abandoned mosque is the symbol of a struggle that's already been lost. Jakarta is sinking, with some districts already 4 meters below sea level. The ground floor of this building has been completely submerged in mud. Residents are in shock.
I have seen the water gradually rising over the years. Now it's underneath my house, so I'm living under sea level.
The city is sinking under the weight of its buildings. Water is flooding in from all sides, a phenomenon that's being exacerbated by global warming. The authorities have decided to construct kilometres of seawall to combat the rising water level. Yet it's not a sustainable solution, and if more serious action isn't taken, 1/3 of the city could disappear by 2050. The Indonesian government has just made a very radical decision, pledging to move the capital to the neighbouring island of Borneo.
We're doing this in the name of economic equality and justice. It's the vision of a developed Indonesia.
It's a project that's looking towards the future, but one that sounds somewhat like an admission of defeat. There are currently no plans for saving Jakarta from being submerged, nor for rehousing its some 10 million residents.
Well, the effects of extreme weather have already hit animal populations, and their plight is being exacerbated by poachers and illegal traders. Representatives from more than 180 countries are meeting in Geneva today to decide how to protect the planet's most vulnerable species. Elephants and sharks are at the top of the agenda in this year's Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. It comes 3 months after a UN report on biodiversity warned that extinction is looming for over 1 million species of plants and animals.
The fate of dozens of endangered species will be decided in this conference center in Geneva. Over the course of 2 weeks, 183 member states are set to discuss the tightening of rules that govern the trade of plants and animals, as extinction is looming for many of them. The treaty already covers 36,000 species, and this year the plight of African elephants is expected to dominate discussions.
In terms of proposals, we have 3 proposals referring to African elephants. 2 of them are coming from southern African countries, and they seek to liberate or to open up trade in ivory.
Some countries argue that the regulated sale of ivory would satisfy a demand from Asia that is fueling illegal poaching. Sharks will also be high on the agenda. Coveted for their highly valuable fins, some 100 million are fished every year. Conservationists warn that the ocean predator is slowly disappearing.
If no more fishing, no more mortalities, and no more sharks were to be killed in the North Atlantic from today, scientists estimate it will be 2070 until the population recovers even to kind of a base level where fishing would be advisable again. It's kind of terrifying.
The meeting follows warnings of the rapid decline of endangered animals. Earlier this year, a UN report found that 1 million species are being pushed to the brink of extinction.
And that's it from us. More news coming up in 15 minutes.